This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of this podcast, I'm here, as the title suggests, to talk of the stories of films. And if it's your first time, I tend to dig into production stories, development stories, release stories, just any little nuances, nerdy stories in and around getting the kind of films that we know and sometimes love to just that state, the kind of films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have a mainstream leaning to them, and they also tend to be aligned with films that I'm interested in or invested in at some point. At some point, in some degree. I don't really do snark, so if you have to snark, this isn't the podcast for you. Nonetheless, I'm here really to celebrate the movies and just how difficult it is to get a film to the big screen. The two films I'm going to talk about in this particular podcast, well, I do like them both. And the first one had a bit of a journey courtesy of another film that suddenly started looming on the horizon. Let me play you a clip and I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
Ladies and gentlemen,
the Martian ambassador is going to say a few words.
come on down, Mr. Ambassador.
Whoa.
That's a Martian? Ew, that's gross.
My God. Yikes.
Hey, we all make mistakes, Mr. President.
This could be a cultural misunderstanding.
That then was a clip from 1996's Mars Attacks, directed by Tim Burton. The screenplay and screen story in the end were credited to Jonathan Gems, although there are a few other names in the mix as well, which I'll come to shortly. The cast list is enormous, so I'm just going to do a few of them. You've got Jack Nicholson in two roles. You've got Glenn Close, Annette Bening, Pierce Brosnan, Danny DeVito, Martin Short, Sarah Jessica Parker, Michael J. Fox, Rod Steiger, Tom Jones, Natalie Portman in there as well, Pam Grier, Jack Black, small little role for Jack Black, one of his earliest screen roles you'll find in Mars Attacks. And I find it a fascinating film, but it's a fascinating film that's really got quite deep foundations to it, in that whilst the film arrived in cinemas in 1996, the first attempt to mount a Mars Attacks film went back more than a decade and didn't have Tim Burton involved at all. So, the origins go back to the Topps trading card series, a controversial series of trading cards with stories on the back that were released for the first time in 1962. One of the people who was an avid collector of them was former Moviedrome host and the director of Repo Man, Alex Cox. And for a while, you can still find it by going through Internet Archive services. Alex Cox had a tremendous website where he detailed a lot of the projects he tried to get off the ground in the 80s and 90s, and in fact he put draft screenplays that he penned on his website, the entirety of those drafts, as a whole number of films, well into double figures, that he was trying to get moving. One of them was Mars Attacks. And in 1985, he proposed a movie of Mars Attacks to Orion Pictures and TriStar Pictures, and he came up with the idea of a science fiction film that was based on those trading cards. He collected them as a kid. He was taken to quote the particularly sadistic Martian invasion of Earth. And Cox, in the mid-80s, would do a couple of drafts of the film. And he talks about that. He said draft 1 on his website, he details, was lost. Draft 2 had a page missing, the version that he put on his website, but he said it wasn't a good page, so don't worry. The third draft that he put on is 96 pages long, and the PDF that he included on his website also included his was 8 pages of notes from Orion's readers and executives about that version. Now, that third draft is actually on the Raindance website. If you go into their scripts and old library archive, you can find them, and you get to the end, and there are the script readers' comments. And it was the third draft is dated May the 1st, 1989. It says, "This draft," I'm reading these comments off the screen at the moment, "this draft is a joy and a pleasure to read, a fine blueprint upon which to base a film which is satirical, action orientated, fun, and most importantly carries a strong and viable social message about the effects and origins of consumer culture. In many ways," this is Alex Cox's Mars Attacks, "can be read as a metaphor for American consumerism and imperialistic exploitation in the service of extending capitalism." And it's a very, very positive report on the script. It does say the ending is a letdown. It's worth noting as well that there's a story that went round a year or two ago about Donald Trump being listed as a former American president in the drafts of Mars Attacks, and those were in the Alex Cox drafts of the film. But the project petered out. Orion and TriStar ultimately decided not to press ahead with it, and Cox went off and did other things instead, as detailed on his site. But it came back to life in 1984 when another screenwriter, Jonathan Gems, got to work on a new draft of the film, and Tim Burton at that point became interested in directing. And Tim Burton had made obviously some big hit movies for Warner Brothers, particularly Beetlejuice, Batman Returns. He did the Pee Wee Herman films for Warner Brothers as well, and he was on the lookout for another project. And Gems went off to write the screenplay, and the script that he delivered, the original script that he delivered for Mars Attacks, went through a budget pass process, which is where they go through the script and they tell you roughly how much it's going to cost. Just dipping into television for a minute, Russell T Davies' his book, and Benjamin Cook's book, A Writer's Tale, talks about how Davies would write his scripts for Doctor Who, and then they would have to calculate the amount of special effects days, which was their unit of currency for special effects, it would take to make each episode, and how Davies would have to tune his episode as based on what they could afford, and it would be, you've got to take 3 days of special effects work out of it or something like that. In the case of Mars Attacks, Warner Brothers at this point was thinking, well, the film could be about $60 million would be about the right budget level for the film. The first budget pass for the movie came in at $260 million. This was at a point where nobody had spent $260 million on a film. Waterworld would come out the year after, covered in a previous Film Stories podcast, and that didn't cost $260 million. That cost about 175, memory says. So this was the level of a modern Avengers film just about 20 years ago. So, work clearly needed to be done, and in came different screenwriters over the course of the film's development, and it is fairly brief development really from this point on, because we're in 1994 and the film was out in 1996. So in came Larry Karaszewski and Scott Alexander, who'd penned Ed Wood for Tim Burton. I still think that's Tim Burton's best film. I love that film. They did some uncredited rewrite work on the movie, and what they did is they took out things like some of the scenes of destruction in the film. They just reduced slightly the global scale of it. So in the draft that Gems had put together, there were Martian destruction scenes that took place in India, China and Russia. They were all taken out. The number of characters was significantly reduced as well, which also helped bring the budget under control. There were over 50 named characters in the original idea for Mars Attacks, and that came down to about 22. Even then, I mean, reading that cast list at the start, you can see what they were going for in terms of scale of ensemble. When that went through a similar costing process, the price had come to just below $100 million, but there was still clearly some work that needed to be done. It should be noted as well, incidentally, that Tim Burton did a lot of writing work on Mars Attacks, but refused to take the credit for it. And in the final credit for the movie, the screen credit goes to Jonathan Gems, but when Gems came to do the novelisation of Mars Attacks, he put the credit for Tim Burton in the book, which was a lovely gestures on both sides. I think there were things in the script that needed work still. So there's one thing actually, that the Martians in the film, I mean, one of the delights is the way that they just rampage around the place just saying ack, 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 ack an awful lot. And the ack, ack, ack dialogue was holding dialogue that they put in the screenplay, and they thought, well, we'll come back and replace it with something better later on, and never really came up with anything that they preferred. And as it turned out, the Martian dialogue was one of the flat out delights of the movie. The original drafts, as well as the film, were far more violent and far, far nastier. And so there was drafts where the ray guns that the Martians were firing had very, very graphic impact. So victims had their body parts cut off. There were holes that were being blown through the victims. Some of the victims of the Martians would find themselves melted or burnt and stuff like that. And what they did, what they realised is, first of all, this was going to be quite an expensive film to make. But secondly, they needed a family-friendly rating, really, to maximise the commercial possibilities of Mars Attacks. And they figured, with the script in its state as it was at that point, they were going to get an R rating from the Motion Picture Association of America, which would have reduced the film's audience. As such, all the effects of the ray guns that the Martians fire were toned right down. Instead, they went with the skeleton effect that we get in the final film. And that was a consequence of trying to get a family-friendly rating. Work on the screenplay, though, was just one part of what was needed to bring the cost of Mars Attacks down. Because in the original plan that Burton had for the film, he would be employing his beloved stop frame animation to bring the Martians to life. First of all, Burton had form with stop frame, of course, that the Nightmare Before Christmas, that I'll come to in a future Film Stories podcast, had been a success and an enduring success. He would go on around the time he was involved with the James and the Giant Peach film that was in production. He would go on, of course, to do Corpse Bride and Frankenweenie as feature-length stop frame movies. But when it came to this one, he also wanted to capture some of the spirit of one of his heroes, Ray Harryhausen, and thus he liked the idea of having these really deliberate stop-motion aliens. But they hit some problems, but not before they'd done a lot of experimentation to see whether it was actually going to be possible to do it. So a man by the name of Barry Purvis was hired, therefore, to oversee the animation even before Warner Brothers had greenlit the movie that Burton was trying to get the proverbial boulder up the hill at this stage. He contacted Henry Selick beforehand. Selick had directed The Nightmare Before Christmas, and he wanted Selick to direct the stop frame sequences in Mars Attacks, but Selick was in the midst of directing James the Giant Peach, so he just didn't have the time to do it. So in came Purvis and a fairly sizable team who began what would result in 8 months of animation and test footage work that ultimately was giving them a few problems. So I mean, I hugely, as always, when I'm talking about effects and visual effects work, recommend the work of journalist Ian Fales and his VFX blog, which you'll find at vfxblog.com. He's done an extensive breakdown on the tests on Mars Attacks that I'm just going to give you a brief précis of here, but it's very, very worth seeking out his writing on this subject. One of the problems they were finding with the stop frame was the visors on the Martians, not least moments where they steam up and just the little gags there. That was incredibly hard to get right. Secondly, stop frame was very expensive. It was increasingly the long way round to do things, and even now there's a lot of physical infrastructure required to do stop frame, and it's a very long process to do. As a consequence, the price of the movie was going back up, and it was eking back to the $100 million mark, and that wasn't what Warner Brothers wanted to pay for the film. And what changed things around was producer Larry J. Franco, who was working on Mars Attacks, and he'd just come off working on 1995's Jumanji movie, starring Robin Williams, of course. Now, in that Jumanji movie, Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, the effects experts, had done some computer-generated animal work in that film. You might recall the monkeys. They do stick out a little bit now, but at the time, it was pretty groundbreaking stuff. And what Franco wanted really was on the quiet, without telling Burton, just on the side, that he went to the team who worked on Jumanji with him and asked them to mock up what a computer generated version of the Martians from Mars Attacks could look like, and they used some of the plates that they'd been working on from 1995's Jumanji to do some of the test footage for Mars Attacks, and ultimately they presented those tests to Tim Burton, and to his surprise he was won over. And they were trying to do little things to compensate as well. They were trying to put motion blur on some of the visual effects just to make it look like they were stop frame, but Burton resisted that as well in the end, and ultimately he decided that that computer generated Martians were the way forward on the project. As a consequence, just to give you a flavour of how much impact that made, the budget at that point for the film came down from $100 million to $80 million as a consequence of that decision. Now, I always look at a film, Skyline, which I know some people like, some people don't. I always think it's quite a fascinating film because that was a $20 million movie that just gives you an audit, really, of what $20 million of special effects buys you. And at the time, I thought it bought you an awful lot. I thought in its own way that's a quietly pivotal little movie. In the case of Mars Attacks, this was an absolute demonstration of the difference between physical and digital filmmaking, and it's kind of evened out a little bit now, but nonetheless it was that switch to computer generated Martians that allowed Mars Attacks to go ahead and finally persuaded Warner Brothers to give the film the ultimate green light. But this had all taken a bit of time. So we're into 1995 now. Filming originally on Mars Attacks was due to begin in August of 1995. But a delay hit because by this point there was Warner Brothers had become increasingly aware of another alien invasion film that was on the horizon, and that film was Independence Day, starring a relatively unknown film star, although not TV star at the time, by the name Mr. Will Smith. You may have heard of him. At the point this is being recorded, he's fighting himself in cinemas in Gemini Man, and there's a story and a half behind that film, I'd contend. Now, whilst they were insistent, and they'd have to defend this a lot throughout the production and release of the film, that Mars Attacks was a very distinct film from Independence Day, there's no getting away from the fact that this was a movie about an alien invasion. Independence Day was a movie about an alien invasion, and Independence Day was quietly building up its bars, ultimately at the point where its infamous trailer of the White House being destroyed in Independence Day, which was primarily a physical effect, of course, and that really sees the initiative in that film's favour, to the point where Mars Attacks at one point had a sequence in there where the White House had been destroyed and they just realised we just couldn't do it. But still, in the summer of 1995 there was the casting, the casting was getting underway as well. So Mars Attacks was still going to press ahead, although there would be a delay in the start of production whilst it was just rejiggled slightly to accommodate the threat of Independence Day. Now, originally Warren Beatty was set to play the president in the movie, and Hugh Grant was in line to play the scientist, ultimately played by Pierce Brosnan in the film. Warren Beatty, though, he was making Love Affair, his remake of An Affair to Remember at the time, and he notable for not making a quick decision. If you go back to the podcast we did on Dick Tracy, you can find out a bit more, if you don't know it, of Warren Beatty's working modus operandi. Also, Peter Biskin wrote an excellent biography of Warren Beatty. I do recommend checking that out as well. But he was causing headaches for Warner Brothers on Love Affair, and ultimately he was taking an awful long time to and ah over if he wanted to play the president in Mars Attacks. So when it didn't work out with Beatty, ultimately Paul Newman was next on the list, and Paul Newman at one point apparently agreed to star in the film, but ultimately he ducked out of the movie over concerns about the film's violence. Regular Tim Burton collaborator Johnny Depp, he was offered a role in the film but turned it down. The character of the CD Vegas guy, Art Land, that was earmarked for another regular Burton collaborator at that point, Michael Keaton, but for whatever reason that never panned out. There were still 23 characters to cast in the film, and remember, over 50 in the original script. I mean, it's just incredible. What they were trying to do was go to the old style of disaster movies, where they would just get a huge, extensive cast of starry names. But obviously, that's an expensive way to go. Few more expensive than Jack Nicholson, who I'm going to do a mild spoiler for one of his characters shortly. So feel free to duck out at this point and wind forward about 2 minutes or something like that. But Jack Nicholson had worked with Burton Burton on Batman, of course, and the offer went to him to play the president in the movie. But there were concerns that you couldn't kill off a Jack Nicholson character, and so which was one of the plans that they had, and that is said to be the reason why you get Jack Nicholson playing two roles in the film, just so one character can survive and one character can't. Also, Alec Baldwin was at one point in talks to join the cast as a late addition, but he dropped out again for reasons not known. The role of the First Lady, Marsha Dale, went to Glenn Close in the film. Again, there were other choices in the mix there. Stockard Channing was one. Meryl Streep was apparently in the mix at one point as well. Also linked with the film were Susan Sarandon and Diane Keaton. But ultimately, the ensemble finally got together and Mars Attacks could go before the camera. It did so in the shadow of that Independence Day trailer that had landed in the December before. But nonetheless, filming took place and was completed at the start of June in 1996, with Warner Brothers now eyeing a December 1996 release date for the film. That didn't leave an awful lot of time for Industrial Light and Magic to do its work. It had to work pretty much around the clock to get the Martians ready for the film. Elsewhere, there were bits and bobs going with the music as well. I mean, Tom Jones, of course, features in the films, and Burton visits him backstage at one of his Las Vegas shows to persuade him to get involved with that. There's a Slim Whitman tune in the film, which led to a minor raising of concerns from American shock jock Howard Stern, who talked about the similarity to an idea he'd once had. Again, I don't particularly want to spoil exactly what that was. In terms of the production design, I should note as well, they were really trying to capture the look of Doctor Strangelove, as well as the mix of the visuals from the trading cards themselves, and just to really give the film some degree of distinction to it as well. Not least because they also wanted to kill off pretty much half the cast right the way through the film. They did at one point try even to incorporate the heat ray sound effect from 1953's The War of the Worlds, but Paramount would not give Warner Brothers and Burton the permission to do that. One very pleasant upshot from the film is it reunited Burton with his regular collaborator music-wise Danny Elfman, and Danny Elfman scores, I think Danny Elfman and Tim Burton, when they come together, bring the best out of each other, but they'd had a falling out over The Nightmare Before Christmas that had led to Howard Shore scoring Tim Burton's film Ed Wood, but this was the one where they came back together, and Elfman and Burton have gone back to being regular collaborators ever since. But the problem as the film came to release was the gigantic success of Independence Day. There's no way of getting around that, to the point where Warner Brothers really put its hands in its pocket for the marketing campaign for Mars Attacks to really give it a push, to highlight a lot of the comedy elements. And there's a brilliant trailer for it, I remember, that sold it to me straight off the bat. But by the time Warner Brothers did get this into cinemas, this was now a 9-figure project. It had become a blockbuster movie, and it was quite a tough sell. The critical response, I remember when it came out, was on the one hand admiring the just sheer admiration and courage of what it set out to do, but also feeling that the film was just a little bit thin and it didn't quite land all of its punches. I think that's probably a bit fair as well. I think Mars Attacks is an eminently rewatchable film, and once it gets into high gear, I mean, it's just a blast in many different senses. But there was a feeling there was slightly more in the ingredients that had been assembled to make the film. Nonetheless, a whole lot of fun. But nonetheless, Independence Day had already cleaned up, and it hurt Mars Attacks. I'd suggest a degree of factors hurt Mars Attacks, but Independence Day was clearly one of them. And its opening weekend, it got to something like, it came out December the 13th in the US, 1996. Took 9.5 million on its opening weekend, and it got to about 37 million its total box office in the US. I remember fairly late in the day, the UK release was put back to the end of February. Mars Attacks, I should note, came out in the US opposite Jerry Maguire as well. That didn't help. I should say, when the video came out in the UK, Warner Brothers did something quite interesting there. They put it out in a double video pack, with one half of it being a free Mars Attacks t-shirt that I still have, but obviously it doesn't fit me. Nonetheless, there were plans in the aftermath of Mars Attacks that, to be fair, had been a hit overseas. It did get over $100 million worldwide in the end, but it was off non-US business that it really got it over that line. But there had been plans to do another adaptation of Topps Trading Cards, Dinosaur Attacks it would have been, but the box office really didn't measure up for Burton and Warner Brothers to pursue that idea. And in fact, Burton would go off and instead of doing any kind of follow, 3 years later he was back on screens with Sleepy Hollow that he made for Paramount. Nonetheless, Mars Attacks, I think, again, like lots of the stories when we talk about 90s blockbusters, it stands as something really quite distinct. And I do think it's a really, really fun film. I love the score a lot. I love the aesthetic of it a lot. And I love the word ack a lot, as most people do. Perhaps not quite the full sum of its part, but a real struggle to get it to the screen. I mean, the Alex Cox version, those scripts are out there if you want to read them. And they're a very different interpretation of the material, even though quite a lot of the themes are still weaving in there. But the fact that it exists, like most of these films, I'm very, very pleased about. Which brings us to the halfway point of the new episode of Film Stories. Hello. So, just a few plugs. Film Stories Junior Issue 2, my print magazine for under 15s, primarily written by under 15s. That is available for order. You will be supporting the work of young writers who are all rewarded with vouchers that I pay for their work. Film Stories Issue 10, our monthly film magazine, that is also on sale. Huge interview with Adewale Akinnuoye in that, where he talks about farming. Also, we do quite a big dissection of who actually benefits from advertisers in cinemas, which was an awful lot of fun to put together. You can find details on both of those and how to order them at filmstories.co.uk. If you can, please subscribe to this podcast. It really helps. Likewise, leaving nice reviews for the podcast really helps. I am an independent publisher. I don't have marketing budget because I pay writers instead. That's what I use my money for. But as a consequence, I am wholly reliant on word of mouth to get the word around. That is all the plugs I'm going to do. Instead, I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this podcast. So let me play you a clip from it, tell you the story, the other side of this.
Oh my God. Do you know who this is?
No.
That's Warner's older brother.
Who?
Third-year Yale law student Putnam Bose Huntington III and his fiancée, Lane Walker Vanderbilt. First year, Yale law. This is the type of girl that Warner wants to marry. This is what I need to become to be serious.
What? Practically deformed?
No. A law student.
That then was a clip from 2001's delightful Legally Blonde, directed by Robert Lurketich, I believe that's how it's pronounced, based on the novel by Amanda Brown, screenplay credited to Karen McCullough and Kirsten Smith. The cast for this one, led by Reese Witherspoon as Elle Woods, Luke Wilson in there, Selma Blair, Matthew Davis, Jennifer Coolidge, Ali Larter. And the film, I mean, it ultimately came out in 2001, but this is another one that started a little way before, and it started with the life story of author Amanda Brown. That she wrote the core novel that ultimately went up for auction, that ultimately led to the catalyst to Legally Blonde being made. But she was inspired to do so by her own life that she's talked about in interviews, particularly around the time of Legally Blonde's original release. So she talked about how when it came time for her to go off to university / college, depending what country you're in, she told SFGate that she decided to go to Stanford. That's where she decided to go to study law. But that her choice, in her words, was based on her was based when she went to have a look around on the state of the local shopping arcade rather than necessarily the quality of the school itself. That when she went to have her open day and interview, she went round the shops as well, and that she was as much drawn to that as anything else. So she started at Stanford in 1993, and within the first week she realised pretty much that she was in the wrong place. And she's written extensively about this, and I do encourage you to seek her writing out. And she talks about how she saw an advert in her first week for a group called the Women of Stanford Law, and she was very keen to go along and make friends connect with the women of Stanford Law. So she went to the first meeting and found fairly quickly that she didn't really fit in with the people there, that she found a bunch of people who were very angry about things that didn't necessarily make her quite as angry. So one of the things that they were looking to do was launch a campaign to change the word semester to Ovesta, and she just was a bit baffled by that, although that would ultimately turn up in Legally Blonde, as it happened, as lots of her experiences would. So she apparently in that meeting made a few comments about her views on that, and as a consequence some of the people in that room never seemed to speak to her again during all of her time at Stanford. But what that meant is during her early years there, her early months there, that she instead of going to groups like that, she would be writing letters to her friends, and she said how she wrote on pink paper and she had a pink furry pen, and she was writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. And then one day she was sat in one of her classes when the idea came to her to do a parody of law school, and obviously she'd got all these notes, she'd written hundreds of pages of letters by this point, and so she decided to fashion all of her writing into a story, and she put that together into a manuscript that she then sent out, and she sent it out on pink paper. And this was, as it turned out, a very wise move, because it got to the desk of the person who reads manuscripts, and there's a great big pile of white paper, and in the midst of it there's a manuscript on bright pink paper, so that gets pulled out and that gets read. And that was then suddenly how Legally Blonde found itself really quite fast-tracked, because it became something of a sensation that the manuscript went out both to publishing houses, so she got an agent to send it out to publishing houses and to movie studios on pretty much the same day. And Amanda Brown's talked about the fact that the manuscript to publishing houses, well, there was barely a ripple of interest there, but on the film side, overnight a big bidding war suddenly broke out for it, that there were an abundance of studios ultimately interested in the film, and it would be MGM that would prevail. And so it was also at this point that producer Mark Platt was one of the catalysts, that he read it as an unsolicited manuscript and fought heavily for the project. He loved the idea of it, he wanted to make the film, and he was one of the catalysts also to MGM picking the movie up. We're now moving the story forward, though, to the year 2000. So again, by this, after several years of, Brown started at Stanford in 1993, and so we've got this 7-year period intervening. Now in 2000, the project has been picked up as an MGM movie, and Karen Lutz and Kirsten Smith have been hired to write the script for it. And thus, in the spring of 2000, what they did is they headed to the Stanford campus to do some research. There was a decision already that the film would be reset to Harvard rather than Stanford, and this was inevitably down to issues of permission, that Stanford was not keen on its image being portrayed in the way that Legally Blonde portrayed it. The irony is, a few years later, Amanda Brown did an interview with Stanford's alumni magazine, so they're not too bothered about it now, by the sounds of it. So Stanford said no. Also on the shortlist was the University of Chicago. They thought of setting the film there, but they also rejected the opportunity for Legally Blonde to be set on their premises because they objected to a scene where a tutor placed his hand on a student's leg. Even Harvard, which did say yes, sort of said a yes but no, that they said you can use the name Harvard, but you're not coming and filming the movie on our campus and on our premises. And as a consequence, even though it's Harvard where it's said, it's not Harvard that you're seeing whenever you're seeing the vast bulk of the shots in the movie. The Lutz and Smith put their screenplay together, and this was actually starting to come together really quite quickly at this stage. As such, by the summer of 2000, we were into casting. So the script was pretty much in place. Robert Leketich was coming on board to direct the movie, and it would be his directorial debut too, in fact. And Mark Platt gave an interview around the time of the film's release as well, where he talked about the casting, and he did that thing of insisting that Reese Witherspoon was the only choice for the lead role, as you tend to do when you're promoting a film. You don't want to say we got the 9th choice for the top role or whatever. Now, I don't know if Reese Witherspoon was the 9th choice to play Elwood. I can't imagine anyone else playing her now, but she was certainly not the only choice. And in fact, the first person to reportedly get an offer for the role role was Tori Spelling, who turned the role down. Also, Christina Applegate also turned the role down. She was fearing that she didn't like the idea of playing a dizzy blonde, and she just didn't think the film had that much substance to it at the time. And she subsequently has given an interview where she said, "I got scared by the role," admits it was daft to turn it down, but also that Reese Witherspoon did an amazing job. I think that's a really classy interview to give. There are other names who were just banded around. I don't know how close they got to it, but the shortlist reportedly have names like Charlize Theron, Alicia Silverstone, Katherine Heigl, Mila Jovovich, apparently all on the list. But the name Reese Witherspoon bubbled up as a consequence of the film Election. Now, Reese Witherspoon, at this stage, she was a fast-rising movie star who was making some incredibly bold filmmaking decisions, whether by hook, by crook. And I think Reese Witherspoon's hugely intelligent. You just have to look at the way she keeps she runs her book club, and she adapts, she chooses the books to adapt, and she's in control of that material. That she's incredibly sharp woman. And at this stage, the film she was making, she'd been in Pleasantville, which is really good, Election, which is great, Best Laid Plans, that was in there, American Psycho, Twilight Fear. The films she was making that she came to prominence off the back of were really quite something. But she was also at this stage looking for something broader. She knew that she wasn't playing heavily to a mainstream audience with the roles that she picked up. She was still quite young, but she was gaining a lot of buzz in the industry. And Election in particular, her performance in Election is spectacular. And it was Robert Luketic who ultimately, off the back of seeing Election, suggested Witherspoon for the role of Elle Woods in Legally Blonde. Now, Reese Witherspoon did indeed sign on the dotted line. She did so with a couple of conditions. I love the condition, for instance, that she had a clause in her contract that allowed her to keep all the clothes, which apparently she duly did, and good on her. But she was also clear up front, and again in the interview she was giving around the time, that what she didn't want to do was play a stereotypical sorority student, because we'd seen quite a lot of young sorority women portrayed on screen before, and it's not really been a flattering portrayal. So she really immersed herself in the role. She was clear she was going into it in part because she wanted a commercial role that had a chance of crossing over and taking it to the next level in the movie. I said the next level. I'm going all posh and doing all business speak now. It will never catch on with me. So nonetheless, she immersed herself in research for the role. She wanted to make sure she did this properly and brought a different spin on the sorority student character. So she spent a couple of weeks just talking to students and specifically researching the role. She did a day at law school, so she pretty much know what her character was getting into, at least get a very brief flavour of that. Also, she did things like she sat in the cafe at a shopping arcade and watched women shop, and she was just observing and taking that in, and the mannerisms of the conversations, and she fused all that into the role. Nonetheless, when it actually came time to shoot the film, Legally Blonde was a tricky production for Reese Witherspoon, primarily because she'd recently given birth to her daughter, and her daughter had flu and was, as lots of young babies do, obviously, was a bit sniffy and ill and wasn't having the best of health. Nothing massively serious, but the kind of things that stop a baby sleeping through the night, and as a consequence stop a parent sleeping through the night. And so she was oftentimes, while the film was shooting, operating on very, very little sleep, and yet having to play the most bubbly character that she'd ever played on screen. And she admitted in interviews again around the time that playing bubbly wasn't really her thing. That wasn't her character away from films. And so she was really putting everything into this on very little sleep at all. The filming for the movie would ultimately take place from October 2000 to December 2000, and the plan was to obviously have the film in cinemas for the following summer. That a release date for Legally Blonde was earmarked as the 13th of June for a wide release, with a premiere on the 26th of June, although it's one of those films that had a staggered international release. We didn't get it till late October in the UK. However, even when the film was wrapped up, there was a problem, and it was a problem that required a bit of work to fix, because the original ending for the film, again, I'm going mild spoilery here, so no offence all round if you decide to skip. The original ending for the film posited it far more as a romantic comedy. That the key sequences, that a couple of the key sequences of the film is celebrated for, were added incredibly late in the day. And what I'm going to talk now is about the ending of the movie, because there were 2 scenes that were added very, very late on, including the famed graduation sequence that takes place in there. And it's interesting that any kind of relationship wrap-up is just done with a bit of text on the screen. It's just barely acknowledged. But the original film was going to end with a couple and a kiss and just be far more conventional. But the test audiences weren't really happy with that, to their credit. Sometimes we give test audiences a bit of criticism, but in that instance, you have to say they pretty much nailed it, because they wanted to know what happened to the character of Warner, and they wanted to know what happened to the character of Elle. Did she graduate? Didn't she graduate? Did she become a lawyer? What did she do? So it was decided they needed to film more scenes. But the problem was Reese Witherspoon was no longer in the country. She had come to the UK, where she was starting work filming The Importance of Being Earnest. And so the production had to come over to the UK to capture these extra scenes. But even so, they had to do it on a bit of a budget. So first of all, they needed another location to double for Harvard. So there's lots of fake Harvards in the film. The fake Harvard you see in the finale is Dulwich College, around the London area. But the only 2 people who were flown to who were brought to the UK for film, well, Reese Witherspoon was already there, but also Matthew Davis. Every other actor you see in the graduation sequence at the end, their stuff, they were brought back and filmed in Los Angeles. They just got the shots they needed with Witherspoon and Davis while they were in the UK, and then it was all edited together, and that rom-com ending disappeared as a consequence of that. And there's a news report that went on the BBC News, and it's a similar news report to the one I found when I was talking about 28 Days Later, a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it was a film critic, Gunter Cooper, who said a film like Legally Blonde, they did not just tinker with the ending. What started out as a romantic comedy, they re-edited it and reshot sequences so it became more about this feisty woman. Not my phrase, this feisty woman, but that's the exact quote and how it was reported at the time. In fact, it went on to say, quote, they spunked up the movie to turn it into a completely different kind of movie, and that's a bit of an odd quote as well, isn't it? Nonetheless, they did manage to fashion it all together. They also added the sequence at the start where we see the character of Elle Woods, who is brushing her hair, but that's not her. That's not Reese Witherspoon again brushing her hair. There's a stand. That was a very late added scene, and you've got a stand-in there who's doing that. There's a sequence with some frat boys at the start that they wanted that they added also fairly late. They wanted to show the male fraternity side of university. Again, they just happened to encounter when they went out filming some real life frat boy, and they pretty much just filmed them. There's very little acting in them. When the film was wrapped up and ultimately released, well, it proved to be something of a hit. What's more, it was the hit that MGM at the time really, really needed. It was having an abundance of financial problems. In fact, they were bumbling along for some time. And at this point, to have such a profitable movie just come out, well, it was just gold dust to the studio. So it came out in the summer of 2001, had an opening weekend of $20 million, and would go on to make just shy of $100 million in the US alone. It opened at number 1 at the box office as well. That's worth putting. It opened above The Score. Remember that? Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, not Cats and Dogs, off the top of the box office. Also in the top 10 around the same time, Scary Movie 2, The Fast and the Furious, Dr. Dolittle 2, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, Shrek. All those films were around there at the time. But Legally Blonde just went straight to the top of the box office. It was also a success outside of the US as well, although the US turned out to be its primary market for it. It would add another 45 million outside of America. But also it would give MGM not just a hit, it would give it a franchise, and boy did it need that at that time. So Legally Blonde turned out to be a film with something of a tale to it, because a sequel movie first of all would follow. In fact, as it turned out, that you got 2 sequel movies to Legally Blonde, with another on the way. So Legally Blonde 2 came along with higher expectations. I think it's a lesser film, really. I don't think it's as good, but it was also a pretty decent hit. It would make follow in 2003 would make $124 million at the box office of a $45 million budget, and that really not to be sniffed at all. I mean, it's worth noting that the original film had cost $18 million to make, but then the success had upped the price tag of everyone involved. This was, of course, the era of the straight-to-DVD spin-off as well, and God love them. And so Legally Blonde got one that didn't involve Reese Witherspoon at all. Legally Blondes thus followed in 2009, directed by Savage Steve Holland, starring Camilla and Rebecca Rosso in the lead roles. But then there was no expectation on that. It was a fairly blatant cash grab, so was seen as that and was pretty much treated as that as well. However, there was also a Broadway show that came off the back of Legally Blonde, and that was reasonably successful. That ran for about a year and did okay business. Obviously, it didn't run for eons and eons and eons, but still, nonetheless, it then went off and did touring all around the world. But now the Legally Blonde series is back. Such is the ensuring affection and love for the film, and it really is a standout film, I think, 2001's Legally Blonde, that it eschews quite a lot of the conventions of what you might have expected from the film, that it could so easily have just been another drab rom-com with a fairly passive central character who simpers through and stuff like that. Not at all. I think the character of Elle Woods is a spectacularly good one. I think Reese Witherspoon gives it everything and is brilliant in the film. The new film is coming. We know that. The new film is likely to be, at the time of recording, there's a release date of May the 8th, 2020. Whether that will actually happen, I don't know. But crucially, Reese Witherspoon is back involved and is set to reprise her lead role in the upcoming movie. But nonetheless, what we have here is how a surprise hit has spawned a Broadway musical. He's up to 3 sequels, but also crucially, there's an original film there that stands the test of time and really is distinct if you look at the films that were being released at the time, and arguably, to agree, the films that are still being released now. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. Thank you so much for the incredible support you've been giving this podcast, particularly over the last week. I've had loads, but anyone who's ever supported this podcast, I can't get across just how appreciative I am of you. I mean, it's just wonderful. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project, and boy is it a growing project, at Film Stories Pod. You can find us at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. If you go over to YouTube, there now, I think we're up to 50 separate video film stories as well, entirely independent now of this podcast. The stuff we talk about in this podcast, we still all love each other, don't worry. That's at youtube.com/film stories. And then the overall website, filmstories.co.uk. I've waffled on an awful long time again, which I keep trying not to do. So I thank you so much for your time. I thank you for your support. I thank you for your patience, and I'll be back soon with a whole other bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye bye.